broadcasting on the internet airwaves from the great state of Minnesota. My name is Shaun, and you're listening to The Shaun Tabatt Show. Today, my special guest is New York Times bestselling author Joel Richardson, and we're going to discuss his new book, Mystery Babylon, Unlocking the Bible's Greatest Prophetic Mystery, which is published by our friends at WND Books. Joel, welcome to the show.
Great to be on with you. Thanks for having me, Shaun.
Well, this is your first time on the show, so I always like to give new authors just a chance to introduce themselves to the audience, help them get to know you a little bit better. So I always like to think of it as telling a bit of the origin story. So what's the Joel Richardson origin story? What do we need to know about you, maybe as an author, a little bit of your background?
Sure. Well, I've been involved in outreach in various ways to Muslims really since the mid to early 90s. I did that for years, and I fell in love with Muslims early on in my Christian walk. And long term, I had planned on living and working in the Middle East as a missionary. But sort of early on in my life, life happened, met my wife, kids, and my wife has a lot of medical issues, so moving to the Middle East, raising a family was kind of off the table, but I was, again, giving myself to reaching Muslims. It was after 9/11, in the midst of doing a lot of email correspondence and this sort of thing, that I found a lot of Westerners, a tremendous amount of Westerners, including those that called themselves Christians, were actually converting to Islam. And this was pretty shocking to most of us that were involved in outreach to Muslims, because we assumed that most people would be turned off to Islam after 9/11. In fact, many in the West, they found themselves interested. They said, what is Islam? They were really ignorant, started studying it. The Quran became a bestseller. So it was during this time that I shifted, if you will, my focus and really started equipping and trying to train and wake up the church to the reality of what Islam represents. And so in 2003, 2004, I wrote my first book called Islamic Antichrist. And you can see that this was not a touchy-feely, politically correct book. Essentially, it was a comparative analysis of biblical and Islamic eschatology, really getting to the root of the matter, saying that Islam is not simply just another false religion in a series of Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, etc., that Islam is actually the mother of all false religions. It is the greatest numerically in terms of its impact in human history. There's never been a false religion as large as Islam. But it's also, in many ways, that perfect antichrist, that perfect counterfeit religion. And so as I began presenting this, of course, I'm sure you're familiar in the world of end-time biblical prophecy, people can be quite passionate in their opinions. And so there were some that looked at this and said, this makes sense. In fact, most that read my book with an open mind early, they said, nothing has revolutionized my understanding of the end times quite as much as this whole paradigm. But many others, of course, resisted and said, this is impossible. We all know that Pope Francis and his folks are going to start beheading people any day. I'm exaggerating, but the primary focus for so long in much of the Protestant world has been the Catholic Church. And so there was a lot of negative reaction from within the Christian community. So in 2012, I released Mideast Beast, which was a much more thorough exegetical work dealing with all of the primary biblical texts, dealing with the role of Islam in the end times. And since then, there have been a few other books dealing with the role of Israel in the last days. And then, of course, my most recent, Mystery Babylon, where I really take on the final frontier of biblical prophecy, the issue of the great harlot, the longest prophecy in the New Testament, Revelation 17 and 18. I'm very happy with the way the book turned out. It was something that I was working on and off for about 10 years and finally said, now's the time to get it out. And as I said, I feel really happy with the end result.
Thank you for giving us a little bit of context of your background and kind of the writing journey you've been on in this topic area. One of the great influencers historically on this discussion of Mystery Babylon is Richard Hislop. I thought that part of your book was really intriguing. Give us a sense of the kind of scope of his influence and some of the problems we encounter when we really examine his work a bit further.
Sure. Actually, Alexander.
Oh, sorry. Alexander Hislop. As I was reading it in my notes, it's like, that does not sound right. Thank you.
Joel Richardson, Alexanderson Hislop. Alexander Hislop was a Scottish minister, late 1800s. And essentially what he did is, so within the biblical narrative, as we look at this issue of Mystery Babylon, Babylon the Great Babylon at the end of the age, many Christian commentators, expositors, what they've done is they've gone back to the beginning of the Bible, Genesis, and they've said, what is the prototypical Babylon? And so they've looked to the Tower of Babel. They've looked to Babel, and thus they've zeroed in on Nimrod. Now, the problem with Nimrod is that there's really only a few verses in the whole Bible that even talk about him. And so there's not a lot to work with, if you will. However, in extra-biblical Jewish tradition, and not just Jewish tradition, but in a lot of various first century apocalyptic works, and then various traditions that have developed since then, there's quite a lot of information about Nimrod. Now, we can go back to the biblical text, and we can speculate that he was sort of the great enemy of Abraham. He was the anti-type of Abraham, if you will, and we can get into a lot of interpretive speculation, and some of that I think is valid. However, much of the information that Christians have drawn from has been from this extra-biblical tradition. Now, along comes Alexander Hislop, late 1800s. He wrote a work called The Two Babylons. And essentially what Hislop did is he claimed that the Roman Catholic Church today, that it is literally the precise expansion and extension of ancient Nimrod Babylon religion. So what he does is he goes through every symbol, every liturgical element, every doctrine, every piece of clothing, I mean, you name it, in the Catholic Church, and he ties it back to Babylon. And he has this very elaborate story about how Nimrod married this woman named Semiramis, and they formed this religion, and all these details. The problem is that Hislop draws heavily from all of this extra-biblical tradition, but not only that, he expands greatly on it, and much of it is drawn from similarities and symbols. And so some of it really borders on the absurd. And I go so far. Now, let me just say this. Alexander Hislop's work has profoundly influenced many Christian commentators and writers since. I mean, really, they look to him as like Webster's Dictionary. They go, this is the authority. Hislop is the authority on the Babylonian connections of the Catholic Church. But when you really get into it, you study it historically, you find out that actually the overwhelming majority of Hislop's claims are historically unsubstantiated, and they are rooted in completely illogical connections, to the point where he literally says that mere circles, the circle itself is pagan. And thus the Catholics have this circular wafer. Well, that's a symbol of the worship of the sun and so forth. And it borders on complete paranoia. I mean, to the point where, I'll give you an example. Behind me, you can see a couple, I've got up top right there, it's a Christian icon of Jesus. Below that it's actually a tile with what we usually call the Magen David, the Star of David. And then below that is a picture of a ceiling of a mosque. Why do I have those? Because I love architecture. I love art. I worked in the world of art for 20 years. I appreciate the history of all this. I've had so many people write me and say, Joel, it's obvious that you're a Illuminati, you're a pawn of the, Illuminati, the globalists, or you're a Jesuit, or this, that, or the other thing. Why do you have this satanic symbol and have all this stuff? Listen, God, he's bigger than the devil. And I don't know if people realize this, but Satan does not own symbols. Satan does not own shapes. Maybe Satan has tried to say this particular symbol is used historically. Maybe it is. But to most people today, it represents the state of Israel. Now, even if the history of that is not rooted, that's okay. Satan doesn't own this particular star. God is far bigger than the devil. So another example, let me just give you an example. You'll see I talk with my hands a lot. So when I preach, I've actually had somebody who went and they took screenshots of me preaching, and I'll find, I'm making different hand gestures, and they'll freeze frame it and be like, look, Joel is making some Illuminati hand gesture. Well, in one video, and I have no idea why I did this, but I actually was kind of doing one of these. I think I was actually counting too. Why I did that, I don't know. I can't think. I can't multitask as I'm preaching. So this is clearly a satanic symbol. Well, it could be. Satan, there is a satanic symbol like this, or it can mean I love you, or it can mean the Texas Longhorns. And so depending on who is interpreting it, it means different things to different people. So you'll have all these pictures all over YouTube of George Bush doing this. Well, clearly he worships the devil. No, actually, he's from Texas, and he's a Texas Longhorns fan. So it's this type of thing that Hislop makes all these connections, these various symbols, and he assumes that it can only have this Babylonian connection. When you really get into it, you look at the history, Semiramis, she lived 1,200 years. She lived well over an entire millennium apart from Nimrod. They didn't even live in the same century or millennium. And so as you really begin to deconstruct Hislop's work, we see that it is a historical, theological fraud. And it has informed much of the church regarding, now listen, I'm a Protestant. I'm not a Catholic. I believe that there are a lot of traditions of man and different things that have crept into the Catholic Church. I don't believe in the Immaculate Conception. We could go down the list. I'm a Protestant for a reason. I believe in salvation by grace through faith, etc. But to say that Nimrod could walk into a Catholic church today and he would recognize every element of the Mass, that it's all pagan, it's historical nonsense, and I demonstrate that in the book. And this is essential that students of prophecy and of the scriptures recognize the impact that Hislop has made, and they separate the wheat from the chaff here and get back to actual biblical exegesis that actually function as Bereans and not cling to the traditions of men.
Now, as we look across, say, world history, who are some of the, say, cities and kingdoms that have been potentially identified as Mystery Babylon? Obviously, you're making a case for something else, and we'll get to that next. But before where you're going, who are some of the other places that have been identified?
Of course, the first big one is the city of Rome. And of course, all the folks that believe that it's the Catholic Church, they go, yes. But what they don't realize is that the early church believed that it was pagan Rome. Because, ancient pagan Rome was thoroughly pagan. Now, of course, after Rome sort of began to fall and wane, they gave up that position for quite a while. And the next major position was that it was Islam. The next position that emerges in history was Islam. Well, then came, of course, the Reformation. People went back to Rome, except now they sort of rewrote it as a revived Rome or the Vatican. Very popular today. The other big one, of course, is Jerusalem. That Jerusalem itself is actually in this sort of very inverted, flipped on its head narrative that it is Babylon, as opposed to, Babylon is the entity that came and attacked Jerusalem. This is actually held by many widely recognized New Testament scholars. N.T. Wright, considered by some to be the leading New Testament scholar of our day. And, you've got others. Some people in a broad way say that it's not a city, it's all metaphorical, and it speaks of just apostate Christianity in general. Others say the Illuminati. Some people say, many literalists beginning in the late 1800s, that it would be literal Babylon, would be rebuilt in Iraq, and that we should expect to see that any day. If you read some of the works by Joel Rosenberg, Mark Hitchcock, when we invaded Iraq in part 2, the Iraq War part 2, they said, what's going to happen is Iraq is going to become incredibly wealthy, successful. We are going to see the greatest accumulation of wealth and the rise of this nation. And of course, it's been well over a decade, and Iraq is in complete ruins. I just came back a few weeks ago. I go there semi-regularly. And so what I do in the book is I work through each of these positions. I look at the strengths. I look at the weaknesses. Of course, some people say it's actually New York City. This is a increasingly very popular view in many end-time prophecy circles. And there are elements of the prophecy that seem to line up with New York City or Wall Street. The problem is that there are many other aspects of the prophecy which they don't simply not line up. They actually clash with, for instance, New York City or Jerusalem or Rome. And so in each of these interpretations, I lay out the strengths and I also lay out the weaknesses.
And the big case you're making here in the book is that Mecca, Saudi Arabia really fits the criteria for Mystery Babylon. Walk us through some of the ways this is a very plausible option.
Sure. Well, and again, I think for most people who hear this the first time, it's fairly dubious. And one thing I'll say, Shaun, that's been interesting in writing this book is I've found that for those who do have a position, because admittedly, this is a very difficult prophecy. It's a very mysterious prophecy. It's why it's mystery. Babylon the Great. There have been some incredibly passionate opinions about this. Most people who have an opinion are very passionate about it. And I tried to lay out this position that it is indeed Mecca, the kingdom of Saudi Arabia, not as though this is the end all, this is the solution, this is the great mystery solved, but as you said, a very plausible explanation, something that even if it is not the ultimate fulfillment of the prophecy, Mecca is certainly one of the great Babylons of human history, if not the greatest. And we as the church need to wake up because it is the greatest Babylon of our day. Could something emerge in the future? Certainly. Could a literal Babylon be rebuilt in the future? Certainly. Of course, that pushes the return of Jesus out quite a ways. But I think at the very least, we as students of the scriptures need to seriously consider this idea that the kingdom of Saudi Arabia, that Mecca, is actually the solution to the prophecy. So a few of the ways that it lines up. Well, first of all, Babylon the Great is primarily two things. It is a religious entity, a corrupt, religious, corrupting influence, and an economic influence. Now, religiously speaking, Mecca is the single greatest city of idolatry that mankind has ever known. 1.62 billion people, and the second largest religion in the world, by far the single largest false religion that mankind has ever known. 1.62 billion people bowing 5 times a day toward that great idol known as the Kaaba, with this black meteorite embedded into the corner, enshrouded with a black shroud in the same way that Muslim women are covered. You can look at the various worship that goes on in Mecca, around the Kaaba, in the Asharam al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary, as they call it, and it is dripping with paganism. The whole practice of circumambulating the Kaaba, thoroughly Hindu and Buddhist practice. You don't see that anywhere in the Bible. The very symbol of the crescent moon, of course. You can go back into the Bible when Gideon killed Zeba and Zalmunna, Oreb and Zeb, these pagan Midianite kings. What were they wearing? They were wearing crescent moon symbols. When you go to Isaiah 14, the passage where we get the verse that has been misinterpreted to refer to Satan as Lucifer, the very word there is Hilal ben Sachar, which actually refers to the crescent moon. It's the morning star, the crescent moon. Satan himself is represented biblically by the crescent moon. This is the very symbol that Muslims worship under. It's on top of mosques, etc., etc. So there's so much paganism of this city. It is the greatest pagan city in human history. When we look at the kingdom of Saudi Arabia, is she an economically corrupting influence? Saudi Arabia is the single greatest financial corrupting lobby power in Washington, not just in Washington, but globally. You go back when Hillary Clinton had to open up her finances, who were her greatest contributors? Over $100 million from Gulf Arabs, over $30+ million directly from the Saudi royal family. This is a single foreign government, one single family, who is putting millions, multiple millions of dollars directly into the back pockets of not just corporations, not just media companies, but the highest office of the most powerful office in the world. And absolutely, do you think it's because the Saudis really believe in the Clinton initiative? Absolutely not. They don't care about AIDS in Africa. It's because they are buying influence, they're buying power, they're buying whatever it is that they want. The Saudis own American corporations. The Saudis own American real estate. The Saudis own American media companies. I was on Fox News in 2011 with Glenn Beck, Prince Al-Walid bin Talal. A lot of people don't realize he's the largest single shareholder in News Corp, which is the parent company of Fox News. There's a lot of speculation behind the scenes that the reason that Glenn Beck was kicked off of Fox is simply because of this partial ownership shareholder in News Corp, that the stuff that he was doing, you can't do that on mainstream media. That's not allowed. Beyond that, the Saudis have spent approximately $1,500 billion, $1,500 billion over the past 40 years. Now that is, if you take the total amount of money that Protestants spend every year to see the gospel spread around the world, that is as if you take all the money we spend and you multiply it times 4 and spread that out over 40 years. The Saudis are spending 4 times what we are spending, the global church, the single family spending 4 times a year for the past 40 years to spread not just Islam around the world, not just to build the mosques, not just to build the Islamic centers, but to spread the most violent, the most wicked, evil, perverse, insane version of Islam that mankind has ever known. It's called Wahhabism or Salafism. When you look at Al-Qaeda, you look at ISIS, you look at Boko Haram, Abu Sayyaf, Al-Shabaab, any of these radical groups, the Taliban, Ahram al-Sharif, al-Nusra now, the groups in Syria, they find their ideological genesis in Saudi Arabia. They find their financing from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the fountain, is the womb of all of this bloodshed that we're seeing all over the earth, Christians disappearing from the Middle East, being attacked all over Europe, where does it come from? It comes from Saudi Arabia. So this is the beginning of the case. It's the city of idolatry, false religion, and it is the city of economic influence, corrupting the kings of the earth and causing the kings of the earth to commit fornication, which is spiritual fornication, which is idolatry. It's false worship.
Would you mind just commenting briefly on how Turkey fits into the unfolding story we see happening right now in the Middle East? They're a key player.
Yeah, well, as I've said for years, watch Turkey, watch Turkey. It's going to become a radical nationalist Islamist nation. I've been saying this for 12 years. I believe that Turkey is going to lead this coming Antichrist coalition. Now, the thing of it is, and it's really quite ironic, it's intended to be ironic within the prophecy, is eventually this beast, which is a coalition of nations, Antichrist coalition, the beast actually turns on the harlot, devours her, and burns her body with fire. Well, why would Turkey be in conflict with Saudi Arabia? They're actually uniting right now against Iran. Well, the reason is, first of all, historically, Turkey, as the leader of essentially the heart of the Ottoman Empire, they controlled the Middle East for 500 years. They ruled the region of the Hijaz, that's now the whole west coast of Saudi Arabia. And they have a long memory. They believe that the Saudis, they just made up this kingdom. That, they don't have any history of having a kingdom. They just said, we're kings. They made up a kingdom. The Turks feel as though they've taken their property, if you will. And so in many ways, Turkey and Saudi Arabia, they really are sort of the competing Sunni alpha dogs of the region. When I say Sunni, I mean Sunni Islam. Egypt is sort of the intellectual head of the Sunni world with Al-Azhar University. But in terms of who would lead, it's really down to those two. Of course, beyond that, there's an emerging issue with Iran. I believe that Turkey will eventually conquer Iran, and Iran will come under the sway of this emerging Turkish neo-Ottoman empire. The Turks want to revive the empire that ruled the Middle East for 500 years. And I believe in the midst of that, the Saudis, who are, of course, in league with the United States, are going to be a tremendous roadblock to Turkey reestablishing the historical caliphate, the Islamic form of government. And I think it's for that reason that eventually we'll see Turkey and all of the nations that come under her sway eventually turn on Saudi. And as this prophecy says, devour her and burn her body with fire.
And as we begin to wrap up here, a couple of questions I always like to get in. When you think of every reader kind of getting to that last page of the book, what do you most hope they take away from reading Mystery Babylon?
Well, this is the thing is, I think for a lot of people, they could say, well, this is kind of an obscure, unusual prophecy. Does it really have pastoral relevance? And I think it does. It makes up a couple chapters of the final few chapters of the Bible. There's a handful of things. First of all, it says that if you are in Babylon, there's a certain point where you're called to flee. I mean, that's a very real, practical, pastoral issue. And if, a lot of people are saying it's the United States, well, if it's the United States, we want to get that right. If we're called to flee, this is a profound pastoral issue. If it's not the United States, then I don't want to flee this country believing that the Lord's telling me to. So this is an issue that we have to get right. Second of all, the scriptures say this is going to be a profound, as we said, religious and economic influence in the end of the age. And if we're at the end of the age, and I believe we're rapidly approaching that time, we want to have discernment. We want to know what's unfolding in the earth. We want to have clarity. We want to be like the sons of Issachar. Jesus, he commands us to understand the signs of the times. He rebuked the scribes and the Pharisees in Matthew 16 for not knowing the signs of the times. And so we want to have clarity in order that we can be encouraged, lift up our head as our redemption draws nigh, because the ultimate purpose of the end times is, yes, so that we'll have understanding and clarity, but also for the sake of urgency. And this is really what the end times is fuel for pastorally. It is fuel for urgency for holiness, urgency for intercession, urgency for the proclamation of the gospel, the completion of the Great Commission, and giving ourselves to missions. And so, this is right at the heart of who we are called to be as a people. And so I believe that this is not an obscure, irrelevant prophecy. I believe that we need to reclaim the whole topic of biblical prophecy, because there's a lot of silliness out there, a lot of excess. The cults love to plant their flag here. And we as responsible Bereans and students of the scriptures need to give ourselves to these portions of the Bible, not exclusively, but we can't give them up to the fringe. And so I believe it is a very important topic. And ultimately, if someone's an unbeliever, I hope that they'll look at this and say, my gosh, this makes sense. How could this have been spoken of so clearly so many thousands of years ago? This book actually contains not just prophetic, accurate information, but moral claims on my life from my Creator. And my prayer is that they would repent and give themselves to their Creator, which is the most natural thing in the world to do, and repent and become followers and students, disciples of Jesus.
Now, you have several other books in addition to Mystery Babylon. For readers who enjoy this book, which of your other books would make a great follow-up read?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, Islamic Antichrist, Mideast Beast, Mystery Babylon, those three are really dealing with the issue of Islam in the last days. And then the fourth book, the title is called When a Jew Rules the World. This is where I deal with everything Israel-related, the history of Christian mistreatment of the Jews, replacement theology, what is amillennialism, what is premillennialism, what is postmillennialism, all of these things. I take complicated matters and simplify them and make them understandable for your average reader. But these are critical matters that we need to get right in this day. As I said, if we're approaching the last days, we can't afford to be ignorant of a lot of these critical matters.
Now, Joel, if the listeners want to connect with you and find out more about your books, where should they go on the web?
Sure. Well, I'm at joelstrumpet.com. Got a lot of free resources there and also a lot of DVDs and different teachings. And I do have a weekly podcast most weeks. I do it about a half-hour video podcast called The Underground with Joel Richardson, and I put up each new one there on joelstrumpet.com.
As always, we'll make it easy for the listener. I'll have links to all of Joel's websites, social media, places you can buy his books in the show notes for this episode. As always, you'll be able to find that over at shauntabatt.com. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Joel Richardson. Once again, our book today was Mystery Babylon, Unlocking the Bible's Greatest Prophetic Mystery. To connect with Joel and find out more about his books, be sure to visit his website at joelstrumpet.com. You can also find out more about this book on the publisher's website. That's available at WNDBooks.com. And Joel, I just want to say thanks so much for sharing with us today. It's been a great pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you so much, Shaun. I really appreciate it as well. Lord bless you.
And that's all for this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show. If you have a question, comment, or suggestion, you can connect with me via email using show@shauntabatt.com. Be sure to follow me on Twitter, where I go by the Twitter handle @stabatt. And if you enjoy the show, head on over to iTunes and leave us a review. Until next time, this is your host, Shaun Tabatt, signing off.